Hello, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is The Advocate, and today I'm an advocate for books you should read while you wait for the winds of winter. Oh boy, I don't have a script for this, so hopefully this all comes together. So I'm no fool, ladies and gentlemen. Whether you're a regular connoisseur of content from The Advocate or not, I know that the grand majority of you guys who are watching this video are predominantly fans of the A Song of Ice and Fire series and haven't really paid much, if any, mind to other book series out there. However, what if I were to tell you that while you wait for the Winds of Winter, which most of us have been waiting for 13 plus years now, that there are other great, wonderful series out there in the book reading world that are just as, if not maybe even potentially more deserving of your attention than the upcoming book, The Winds of Winter, which may or may not ever come. Well, that's what this video is about, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here to tell you guys some great reads that I fully recommend you guys check out if you desire to, while you wait for that long fabled sixth novel in the A Song of Ice and Fire series, and see if it could be to your liking, guys. So let's get started. Like, comment, and subscribe to support a small channel. So ultimately, if you're a fan of the A Song of Ice and Fire series, I think it's safe to say that you're a fan of George R.R. Martin and his writing style. And if that is the case, then I would actually urge you guys, well, if you haven't already done so anyway, which I imagine most of you have already done so, but if you haven't, if you've read the first 5 books in the main A Song of Ice and Fire series, then I actually recommend that you guys check out maybe some of George R.R. Martin's other works that are still within the A Song of Ice and Fire series, whilst not being within his main 5 entries in the predominant catalog when people think of the Game of Thrones series. And those 2 books are the A Night of the Seven Kingdoms novella compilation, also by George R.R. Martin, and Fire and Blood, which is super topical right now, especially considering all the controversy surrounding the House of the Dragon TV show adaptation of this book. These are both great reads, predominantly A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. I love A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. The 3 novellas encompassed within definitely have a very, whilst still maintaining George R.R. Martin's writing style, they have kind of a very different, more upbeat, slice-of-life feel to the world of Westeros than what we predominantly see within the main 5 books of the A Song of Ice and Fire series. It is a great read, and if you haven't already done so, I definitely recommend checking this book out either from a library or purchasing it at your local bookstore. It's a lot of wonderful stuff in here, a lot of wonderful stories, again in novella form, following just 2 characters of a hedge knight named Sir Duncan the Tall and Egg, who may be more than what he appears to be, and it's a great story. I definitely recommend it. So again, if you're waiting for the Winds of Winter and haven't already done so, definitely check this book out. And if you have read this book, then I imagine most of you have already read this one, but if in case you haven't, Fire and Blood. Now, obviously there's a lot of controversy right now surrounding the House of the Dragon TV show adaptation. This video is not about that. But if you want to check out the source material that House of the Dragon is based off of, and for some reason haven't done so already, Fire and Blood is what you're looking for. It's a prequel that spans about 130 years, that begins about 300 years prior to the events of the first Game of Thrones book. And it's a good story. I mean, it's not a story within the traditional sense as in you have, POV characters and, they're all detailing what's going on, but rather it's more of a history telling that takes kind of an omniscient point of view away from the main kind of character-centered focus of the A Song of Ice and Fire series. So it's a different style of storytelling. It's more historical, it's more dry, but the history that is told within, in my opinion, is pretty interesting, and I think it's definitely worth a read, especially if you want to see where the material from Fire and Blood kind of surpasses the material from the House of the Dragon TV show. So if you, for some reason, haven't read these 2 books, but have read the main A Song of Ice and Fire series and are waiting on the Winds of Winter, then definitely check these 2 books out. They're worth your attention. But let's say you're thinking to yourself, oh, come on, Advocate, those are softball answers. Of course I'm an A Song of Ice and Fire series fan who has read Fire and Blood and A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. Give me something for my pain. Well, if that's the case, then I do have some other great series here for you guys to check out. Now, there are a few things to keep in mind. One, if you are a huge fan of George R.R. Martin and are looking for essentially a one-to-one replacement for George R.R. Martin's writing while you wait for that long fabled The Winds of Winter book, you're not going to find it. Every author has their own distinct, unique writing style that is separate from that of George R.R. Martin. Everyone's got their own flair, their own quirks, their own strengths and weaknesses, and yes, that does include the big G, Big George R.R. Martin. It would be similar to if you were looking for someone like, oh, I want someone to fill the void that Brandon Sanderson has left in my heart, and I want to read this George R.R. Martin book. Well, that's not going to be the case because Brandon Sanderson and George R.R. Martin are completely different writers. Speaking of Brandon Sanderson, I think the number one book that I think of as like maybe my favorite, or one of my favorites, if not possibly my favorite book that I've ever read of all time, is The Way of Kings, and that is the first book of the Stormlight Archive. The Stormlight Archive currently consists of 4 books, soon to be 5 books within his, one of Brandon Sanderson's mega series, his magnum opus, which is the Stormlight Archive. It's a fantastic series. If you're someone who loved the world building in George R.R. Martin's books and are looking for something that kind of matches that level of world building, that level of intricacies of cultures and all this wonderful things that are happening within the world of Westeros and Essos, then Stormlight Archive is definitely what you're looking for. The world building within this series is some of the best I've ever read in fictional literature ever. The Way of Kings is maybe, I don't know if it might, if it's not my favorite, it's definitely in my top 3 favorite books of all time. And yes, that does include a top 3 that includes The Storm of Swords. It is that good in my opinion. Now, again, to reiterate, Brandon Sanderson is a different writer than George R.R. Martin. So if you are looking for someone who is going to give you the same prose as George, Brandon is definitely not it. Brandon has a very prosaic, kind of utilitarian way of writing prose that a lot of people find to be kind of unattractive. And to be fair, yes, out of all the authors that I'm going to recommend, Brandon Sanderson is probably the least poetic in terms of prose. However, the story that he has to tell, especially in the Stormlight Archive, is some of the best stories I've ever read in fantasy. Just very well done story arcs, even some very decently written characters, particularly Kaladin, who is the main character of the first book. He is probably my favorite character in all of fantasy. It's a wonderful series, lots of magic. So if you're someone who, you read the A Song of Ice and Fire series and we're like, oh, the magic is kind of underutilized here in this series, you'll definitely get more than what you bargained for within the Stormlight Archive. It's a very high fantasy magic galore kind of thing. And it's great. It's wonderful. I love it. It's a wonderful story. I will say that if you choose to pick up the Stormlight Archive while you wait for the Winds of Winter, I do think my recommendation would be to check out maybe something that is more accessible from Brandon Sanderson's catalog, such as Mistborn, before you jump into The Way of Kings. Not only is The Way of Kings and pretty much every book within the Stormlight Archive this giant kind of cinder block sized book, but having to read 1,200 to 1,300 pages worth of, again, to be subjective, relatively unattractive text maybe is not something you want to dive fully headfirst into. So if that is the case, then I definitely recommend checking out Mistborn as to kind of give you an appetizer for Brandon Sanderson's work. Again, it's different. It's not gonna feed you maybe in terms of super shades of gray characters like the A Song of Ice and Fire series does, but in my opinion, it has better world building than the A Song of Ice and Fire series, and the magic here is some of the best I've ever read. So Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive, with the, I guess, caveat that you maybe check out the Mistborn Era 1 trilogy prior to checking out the Stormlight Archive, is one of my big recommendations for books that you should read prior to checking out the mythical 6th book of the Song of Ice and Fire series that may never come. Now, if you've already read Brandon Sanderson, it's like, all right, Advocate, I've already read all the books in the Stormlight Archive. I've read the entire Mistborn Era 1 and Era 2 trilogy. I've read Elantris. I've read Warbreaker. I've read all, Brandon Sanderson's millions and millions of books that he seems to pump out on a regular basis. And you want something, it's like, I want something else. It's like, all right, well, something that's a little bit more in line to what George R.R. Martin, who George R.R. Martin is as a writer, would be the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. The First Law trilogy, the Blade itself, originally published in 2006, and Last Argument of Kings, originally published in 2008, and Before They Are Hanged, originally published in 2007. Again, I kind of did those a little bit out of order. Are the debut trilogy grimdark fantasy books by Joe Abercrombie that encompass 3 of the most well-developed characters, more well-developed than anything in the A Song of Ice and Fire series I've ever seen. 3 of the most well-developed characters in fantasy as they embark on a quest. Well, I don't want to speak more on this because I don't want to spoil you guys, but it is a very well-written story arc that encompasses 3 books. And if you're looking for something gritty, something with more of a dark edge, something that subverts your expectations, a la the A Song of Ice and Fire series, then the First Law trilogy is definitely for you. Now, I will say that personally, in my subjective opinion, the First Law trilogy definitely has a few narrative quirks that I'm not particularly a fan of, a few narrative reveals that I think kind of detract my enjoyment of this series. And in addition to that, the trilogy in and of itself is very dark, and I did not like how the trilogy ended, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't well written. This is a complete story arc that definitely ties things with a neat bow, and I respect the heck out of Joe Abercrombie for writing this dark story that, although I don't agree with the message of, and I even don't agree with some of the narrative threads, which you could honestly poke holes through, I think it's still very well written, and it's very much worth the read if you want something that's sort of similar to the A Song of Ice and Fire series, but maybe a little darker. So that's the First Law trilogy. Another book series that I recommend if you're someone who wants to stay within the fantasy niche is the Kingkiller Chronicle by Patrick Rothfuss. Now, I do have to preface this that similar to George R.R. Martin, who has yet to complete his series, Patrick Rothfuss has also infamously not completed his trilogy. Now, at least George R.R. Martin wrote 5 books. Patrick Rothfuss only wrote 2 of his promised trilogy. Now, I'm not here to rag on Patrick Rothfuss. Everyone has their own reasons for not being able to complete a series. In this case, Patrick Rothfuss kind of went through some mental health issues, and he just wasn't able to get that 3rd book out as quickly as he wanted to. So similar to the A Song of Ice and Fire series, people have been waiting for The Winds of Winter since 2011. People have been waiting for The Doors of Stone, the 3rd book in the Kingkiller Chronicle trilogy, since the 2011 release of The Wise Man's Fear, the 2nd book in his trilogy. So it's another incomplete trilogy. It's another incomplete series. So if that's going to bother you, then definitely don't check these books out. But if you like the prose in the A Song of Ice and Fire series and want some more prose that in fact even surpasses the prose in the Song of Ice and Fire series, then Patrick Rothfuss's The Kingkiller Chronicle is for you. Now, if you've seen my reviews of this trilogy, well, this, I guess, duology of what is intended to be a trilogy, then you know I have some problems with this series. I enjoyed most of The Name of the Wind. I enjoyed parts of The Wise Man's Fear. And a lot of that has to do with the narrative choices that Patrick Rothfuss makes, particularly within The Wise Man's Fear, that aren't to my liking, but I cannot deny that this man is a poet, and he knows how to write some melodic paragraphs, some prose that'll definitely get you invested in his story. So if you're waiting on The Winds of Winter and have read Brandon Sanderson and Joe Abercrombie, Patrick Rothfuss might be someone you want to check out. Just be warned that it's not yet completed, and maybe some of the narrative threads might not be to your liking, but we'll see. And by the way, all these books that I've mentioned thus far are books that I personally have read, books that I've even reviewed for this channel, and books that I intend to review for this channel. So definitely be on the lookout for videos on those books if they're not already on the channel. So yeah, check them out. And I guess to cap off my recommendations for books you should read, it goes without saying that the fantasy world would not be what it is if it wasn't for the man, the myth, the legend known as J.R.R. Tolkien. The Lord of the Rings plus The Hobbit is revolutionary. It is well known, it is famous, and it is famous for a reason. And if you haven't read these books, but have read pretty much everything that was inspired by J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, then I definitely recommend you check out the books that started this entire humongous, inspiration of this fantasy world that all began with this Middle-earth trilogy / quadrilogy, if you want to include The Hobbit in there. Now, I love The Lord of the Rings. I really do. I will say that if you are someone who has not read The Lord of the Rings but has read everything else that is inspired by The Lord of the Rings, and you go back and read The Lord of the Rings, it does have a couple of quirks that definitely maybe haven't aged too well. Predominantly because this trilogy slash quadrilogy began a lot of narrative themes, a lot of things that are now considered cliches within fantasy literature that at the time were definitely not cliches and were very new and revolutionary for fictional literature, if not literature at large. So I love Lord of the Rings, but I definitely do attest that if you're someone who wants to go back and read these books, you kind of have to kind of set your brain back to the 1950s when you read these books, because there's a lot of things here that are like, you know, the hero's journey. It's like, oh, the evil dark ruler. Oh, the power of friendship. You know, things like that. Oh, evil magical artifact. A long wandering journey where we, in an RPG kind of way, get to meet all these different classes of races, and we all come together, and though we don't like each other at the beginning, we become best friends by the very end of the story. You know, those kind of tropes, they're definitely present here, but it's a wonderful story regardless. And, you know, obviously removing the sensibilities that we now have in 2024, where we're now kind of over those cliches, they're still very well told. And, you know, obviously the thing that started the cliche, the reason they became cliches was because they were so good. So if you haven't already done so, which I imagine, hopefully you have already done so, but if you haven't already done so, definitely check out The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. But besides that, yeah, those are all things that should keep you busy for the most part while you wait for the Winds of Winter. If you want to read other books that I haven't read, that I definitely recommend checking out prior to that book that may never see the light of day, Jade War, Jade City, Jade Legacy, 3 books in the Greenbone Trilogy by Fonda Lee. Those are books that I've heard wonderful things about. They are on my to-read list. I currently have them here on my bookshelf. There are also books that could keep you busy. I've heard nothing but wonderful things from people who kind of share my reading taste. So if you also share my reading taste, which I imagine most of you do if you're a fan of the A Song of Ice and Fire series, and I think these are books that are worth checking out, and I will definitely check them out soon and hopefully give you guys kind of a review of what my thoughts are on this trilogy. The Three-Body Problem, I am currently working my way through the third and final book of the Three-Body Problem trilogy. I like it. It's definitely different. It's not fantasy for one, it's science fiction, but I think, and it's obviously a completely different writing style than George R.R. Martin, what he writes for the A Song of Ice and Fire series. Earlier I said that Brandon Sanderson has the most prosaic writing style. That's not true. As I was reading from the very first page of the Three-Body Problem, I'm like, oh wow, this is really prosaic. The Three-Body Problem is probably the most utilitarian in terms of its prose and in terms of its the scientific way it approaches its text and its story. But from what I've read, you know, the first book I have some problems with. The second book less so, and the third book so far, I'm about a third of the way through the third book. I like what I've read from the third book so far, so it's definitely worth an investment if you want to read something different while waiting. Neil Gaiman, I've read Coraline, great book. The Ocean at the End of the Lane, fantastic book. If you haven't already seen my review of The Ocean at the End of the Lane, I definitely recommend you do so. Neverwhere, I've not read. He also has another book, American Gods, which it's decent, it's okay. And another book that I've heard nothing but wonderful things about, and I intend on reading sooner rather than later, is Shogun. There is a series, I believe it's on Hulu, that's based off of the Shogun book. I'm not sure if it's based off the entire Shogun book or if it's based off of because this is actually part 1 and part 2 of the Shogun book. I'm not sure if the Shogun TV show is based off of both parts of Shogun, the book series, or if it's just based off of part 1 from James Clavell's Shogun book, but I definitely want to read it. I've heard wonderful things about it. This will keep you busy too, if you couldn't already tell by its meaty size. It's 1,290 page length. So that's another book I want to read. The Expanse is also another series I've heard wonderful things about. It's also on my to-read list. I've not read it. That'll keep you busy. The 2 writers who go by the pen name of James S.A. Corey, who wrote the 9 books in The Expanse, they will definitely keep you busy before the Winds of Winter. The 2 writers are actually proteges of George R.R. Martin. So if you loved politics of medieval times, fantasy fictional medieval times, and you'll love politics in space, because that's, from what I've heard, that's what James S.A. Corey have done with The Expanse, and apparently it's really, really good. So I look forward to reading those at some point. I did purchase Fourth Wing last year. I've since heard this is a pretty terrible book. I still want to read it at some point just to kind of have my own opinion on this series that's now a trilogy, if I researched that correctly, by Rebecca Yarros, but it's definitely not what I thought it was going to be. I was hoping it was just more of a fantasy. It turns out it might just be a romance disguised as a fantasy, so we'll get to that when we get to that. But if you really want to check out something that's fantasy light, Fourth Wing is for you. V.E. Schwab, I have not read this. The Shades of Magic series, again, I have not read it. It's on my to-read list. I've heard great things about it. Definitely worth a read. So yeah, guys, there's just a lot here to keep you busy. So if you are stuck and glued on the A Song of Ice and Fire series, and you're just like, man, I just really want to read The Winds of Winter, and that's all I really want to read, you're doing a disservice to yourself. There's a lot of other great series out there, guys. They may or may not fill the wind-sized shaped hole in your heart, but they're there, and they're really great. There's a lot of great stuff here, guys. There's a lot of great stuff out there. These are just some of my recommendations for books to read while you wait on The Winds of Winter. So hope you guys enjoyed this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a like, comment, and subscribe to support a small channel. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you guys soon for some more A Song of Ice and Fire and non-A Song of Ice and Fire content, guys. Seriously, check out some of my non-A Song of Ice and Fire content. There's a lot of great books out there that are worthy of your attention. And once you read those, definitely check out my videos on them, because I like to think that I did a pretty good job of reviewing those non-A Song of Ice and Fire books. So, hooray. Thank you guys so very much for watching this video. Until next time, The Advocate, out.